So one of our members attended this awesome seminar that you gave in Professor Bonnie Berger's class this past spring, where you spoke about novel graph neural networks for biomedicine. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that research and how you integrate multiple sources of information and your thought process when you develop these.
Absolutely. So I think biology, medicine, or scientific data in general are really very exciting type of data that creates lots of opportunities for interesting machine learning applications to be, and also interesting, creates lots of challenges that require development of new methodology. So in biology in particular, there is often the case that for any problem that you're interested in, it's not that there is a single data set or single data type that might be most relevant for that problem and can fully capture the complexity of the phenomenon that we are studying. For example, even intuitively, it might be clear that if we are trying to understand the relationships between diseases and drugs and what might be potentially a drug that will treat the disease, it's not only important to know what are the symptoms of the disease, what are the side effects of drugs, but it's also important to know how those drugs work, how do they affect human body when we ingest them, what kind of proteins they bind to, how do those affect proteins throughout the human cells. So that means that there is a number of different data types, a number of different data sets that we need to bring together in order to be able to really fully model many biological phenomena. And a very natural way of doing that is by using and adopting this notion of graphs or networks, which are a general mathematical language that allow us to bring together heterogeneous types of information and represent that in the form of heterogeneous graphs, not multimodal graphs. Sometimes people say also to them, refer to them as knowledge graphs. So these would be objects where we have nodes or vertices representing different entities that are of interest to us in the context of a particular application. There might be nodes representing human proteins. There would be edges between protein nodes representing how do those proteins interact in the body? How do they physically interact or not? Those proteins might have edges and links with drugs that would indicate whether a drug directly targets and binds to a specific protein. That would be, again, an edge between a drug and a protein. We might have another type of edges between drugs and diseases based on what drugs are used to treat diseases or are prescribed for treatments. And you can imagine like adding more and more types of information would yield more complex knowledge graphs or heterogeneous networks. So that's great because in adopting this representation allow us to make many problems now computationally or kind of machine readable in a way, or like amenable to computational analysis, because we have now this machine readable representation which we can load in. And then an obvious question is we want to learn and reason over those knowledge graphs, over those networks that represents the current state of medical and biomedical knowledge, and we want to go beyond that. We want to make new predictions, new characterizations. And then the question that arises here is that what are effective machine learning methods that allow us to learn and reason over these interconnected graph structured large data sets? So in the last few years, it really has been a revolution in graph machine learning area of research that is most often associated with a concept known as graph neural networks or graph convolutional networks. Slightly more broadly would be graph representation learning, and the following. So when we imagine we have now our heterogeneous graphs, and what we will do, we will specify some deep nonlinear transformation functions. Those will be graph neural networks. That what we'll do, they will take every node from our heterogeneous graph, so from every node from the network, and they will map it to some d-dimensional vector, or we can call it latent feature vector. Most often, we would refer to it as node embedding. And the idea is that two nodes in the graph that have similar interaction patterns, potentially imagine like two proteins that interact with similar drugs that are in turn used to treat similar diseases. Those nodes that are similar, have similar local interaction neighborhood in the graph space would be embedded close together in the embedding space. So the whole idea of those deep transformation functions and graph neural networks is now to optimize functions such that topology of our input graph can be captured well in that learned compact vector space that we call embedding space. So that two nodes that have similar interaction neighborhood are embedded close together in that embedding space. And that's really exciting because it creates lots of opportunities for many applications, because as soon as we have these low-dimensional vector representations of our nodes or even edges or other graph structures, now we can use them very directly for visualization, for clustering, for classifications, for various projections. We can use them to complete knowledge graphs, to make new predictions about new associations, and so on. And that has created really a completely new space for applications in biology and medicine as well, that allow us now to apply deep learning and neural networks much more broadly than just a couple of years ago, because now we can apply it to any graph network data, not only to medical images or natural language text, where we have already seen substantial benefits from deep learning methods.
Sure. So you've done some awesome modeling of drug safety with these networks that you just described, like your work with Decagon, where you model the side effects of drug combinations. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that specific example and any other specific examples that you're working on currently.
Yes, thank you so much for bringing this up. Decagon is one concrete example where we use graph neural networks to predict side effects of combinations of drugs. So let me first spend a minute or so on just motivating the problem. Why would we want to predict that, and why it's really important to be able to do that computationally? So you might have heard of studies where computational models are developed that try to predict side effects of individual drugs. And that's really important, and we need to have good models for that. Those side effects, to some extent, are detected already during clinical trial stages. However, it turns out that in real world, many patients take multiple drugs at the same time. So statistics tell us that actually around 46% of people of ages 65 or more in the US take at least 5 drugs at the same time. And it's not that uncommon to encounter patients that take up to 20 drugs at the same time. So that means that when a patient takes so many drugs at the same time, this creates problems. And problems might be that patients are at much higher risk for developing unwanted side effects that might be simply due to unexpected interactions between drugs, because drugs don't really work completely independently of each other. But and because they at the same time now patient takes multiple drugs, there actually happen those unwanted side effects that affect around 15% of US population. And this is a huge problem because it's a burden for individual as well as for healthcare system. It's also a problem that is really an example of a real world topic or really healthcare relevant area that calls for computational models, because the sheer number of drug combinations is so huge. There are so many possible combinations of drugs that it's impossible to simply examine the safety of those during clinical trials. That's more or less impossible, or even in experimental wet lab settings. So not only we are hoping that computationally we can make predictions more accurate and we can make research faster, but really only computationally we can hope to be able to explore this vast space of drug combinations. So in that project, what we did, we designed a graph neural network, which we call Decagon, that worked on a knowledge graph that was a multi-model network of drugs, the current information on how drugs interact with each other, what kind of side effects they lead to, and then how those drugs work. What is the mechanism of action in the sense of how they relate to proteins, and how do those effects that drugs have on proteins in human body propagate in the underlying biological network. So Decagon actually then learned an embedding for every drug in that knowledge graph, and then learned in the decoding phase how to combine the learned embeddings of drugs in order to be able to very accurately make predictions of the following form. So given a drug A and B and side effects, so we might say I have an aspirin and ritonavir, and I want to know if taking aspirin and ritonavir, which are two drugs, if I take them together, will I see any side effect that I would not expect to see if I would just take ritonavir by itself or just aspirin by itself. So decagon turned out to work really quite well. And it led to a number of follow-up studies where we started thinking about temporal changes in those graphs, where we think, and personalized predictions, where we would want to say, well, how can I then use graph neural networks to be able to design a personalized recommendation for a patient by taking into account the knowledge graph data and then also patient level information for an individual patient. And that requires combining graph neural networks with other type of machine learning models in the way. Recently, graph neural networks, we have also adopted them to in several drug repurposing studies, where the goal is to identify what might be diseases that drugs that are currently already on the market could be used to treat for. And in particularly in one initiative, actually several initiatives, we are working on problems related to COVID-19. And in one particular case, one particular project that we started in March, it really was an example where in 3 months of time, we were able to go from data to prediction that we generated with graph neural networks about drug disease relationships and drug disease recommendations. And now we have already validated a number of those drugs in the wet lab as well as in the human cells. And it's really this short period of time. It's something that I found really exciting as a computer scientist by trying to see how models that we are developing in like very academic research and computer science labs can then contribute to the development of biology and medicine, a completely different science where I don't have any formal training, but really being able to contribute to the research in that area is really something exciting. So yeah, this class of methods is a general class of methods that now allowed us to do learning and reasoning with graphs and be used in many different problems. And specifically, I think those in science, in medicine, are problems that have are potentially very impactful and offer many applications for the good of the humanity and patients.
Sure, that's awesome to hear that you're working on COVID-19 work. Definitely pressing right now. And you've also said that you'd like to give patients guidance on self-care. So I guess what kind of data would you look to integrate on that front? And then do you think our current models or models that you're working on developing could be applied here? Or would you need to develop new algorithms to tackle these kinds of challenges?
So these are great questions. So let me first let me answer in two parts. So first, how to think about providing self-care to patients in kind of, which is a very challenging problem relating to that idea of integrating healthcare or like biomedically relevant data and providing interface for users, or like in this case, customers. So one particular recent project that we started in the lab is actually related to rare diseases. So we are working with a foundation from Spain, actually, which is foundation that brings together young individuals. Mostly those are children that cannot be diagnosed because they have so rare diseases, or they have that they go to doctors and they don't really know what is wrong with them, because somehow they have symptoms that do not match any symptoms of known disease, or they sequence their genome, and the variants that we see in those young children or mutations in genes do not match with the phenotypes, and they do not match with the current kind of medical books in the sense of what disease would they have. And that's a major problem. Why? Because it means that before any treatment can occur, the first thing that needs to be done is that patients need to be diagnosed, right? They need to know what is really the problem to start thinking about treatments. So that foundation really has put together a way for now people from around the world to submit their information about what kind of genetic information or variants they have, as well as symptoms and phenotypes that those children experience, with the goal of actually like using the wisdom of the crowd power. We're essentially saying, well, if we would limit ourselves only to Spain or any individual country, it's really that certain diseases are so rare that there might be only a handful of patients with that particular disease. But when we would do that at a kind of like global international scale, that things become possible. So it's actually, it's a foundation that really works at multiple tiers and kind of brings in directly patient level information, as well as then doctors are able to plug in and kind of browse through some of the reports that parents of those children have submitted and shared for the research purposes. So our goal here is really to be able to represent current medical knowledge in the form of knowledge graphs. So you can think of current medical knowledge is now represented in research literature. PubMed is a very prominent, well-known database that contains all research papers published in the area of biology and medicine. So we are representing that data in the form of knowledge graph, and we think of that as a proxy of what we currently know in biology and medicine. So it's like, it's a computational, again, a kind of proxy that allows us to kind of algorithmically now sweep and parse through that data. And our goal is ultimately, and kind of the progress that we are making is by putting overlaying on that knowledge of patient level information that then can directly be provided to patients in the sense of, given the current data, this would be a set of questions that we can ask to patients in order to further refine their phenotypic image. So that's certainly one concrete project that we are currently thinking about that is closer to patients. But more generally, the second part of the question that you have, like, what are the challenges that prevent existing machine learning research be directly applicable or deployed in those real-world settings? So I like to use this concept that I called actionability, or essentially actionable predictions. And what I mean by that is that in machine learning community, we're really excited about developing new methods, benchmarking them on data sets, and then showing that we have the best AUC score that is state of the art, and we have better F1 scores and other type of performance metrics than existing models, or then some number of baseline models. And that is all great and fantastic, and I enjoy doing that, and I very often do that. But when we then go and try to say and deploy then those state-of-the-art models in real world, there are a number of challenges that come up. So of course, there are these challenges that always arise no matter the applications, like how can we, what is the scalability? What are the required computational resources? How long does it take to make a prediction? How robust are the models to missing data, incomplete data, and so on? These are the problems that appear actually, I think, in many, if not all, deployments of these models. In biology and medicine, furthermore, what is really important is to be able not only to have high AUC score, but to be able to somehow say, why did the model make that prediction? So, and that is probably because it's not only about eureka moments. Here is, I solved the problem, but it's often in science we ask, well, why is this the case? Why have we reached that particular prediction? So, or practically it means that when I work with biomedical collaborators and I present more concretely predictions to them, for example, for COVID-19, here is the ranked list of drugs that we think would have some positive therapeutic effect on COVID-19. The first question I get from collaborators is they look at the first drug and they say, okay, why did your model make that prediction? And if my model simply returns a probability, one scalar, one estimate, like the output of a sigmoid function on the last layer of our graph neural net, that would say this is the probability or likelihood that the drug will be useful to treat the disease, that's not so actionable. It's much more actionable if the model can say that prediction was made, and here's some way of going back to the model and ask, or going back to the graph, which was the input molecular representation of the problem, and ask what are the most relevant parts of it. So towards that end, we are thinking about several different ways. We have made some initial progress on developing a general explainability methods for graph machine learning that allow domain users or users of our systems to ask what if questions. Meaning that the models use counterfactual reasoning, and then allow the users to say, what if I would remove part of the data? How would they change that prediction? And doing that in a way that is computationally tractable and feasible. And certainly then other aspect that we are thinking about is really more interactive systems that allow the feedback of our users to be integrated back into the machine learning model, so that we can create these AI feedback loops.
Sure. So it sounds like working with collaborators like doctors and experimentalists have pushed you to consider more explainable AI models. And coming from a computer science background, is there anything that surprised you about interactions with people that work on the more experimental side or the patient-focused side? And have you learned anything from them, or have they challenged your worldview in any sort of way?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So I would say the answer to all your questions is yes, yes, yes. So first, they challenge my worldview in kind of major ways, because very often, or like at least initially when I was as a graduate student, I was so excited. Oh, here's my new model. It performs so well. And then I went and met with collaborators from biology and medicine, and biologists, showed them the results. And immediately they start asking so many questions that I could not answer, like how to explain predictions, what are the data that are absolutely necessary for prediction, what would happen if I would remove one particular interaction, or I would not know that there is an interaction between two proteins, and so on and so on. So I think in a way I really like that, because it has motivated the development of development of lots of new methodology, and I think it really allows us to kind of think about what are the challenges that needs to be solved. Because when you have a bunch of collaborators, then you meet with all of them, and we talk with them about progress and research, you kind of see that similar questions are arising in all those discussions. And when you see that the same question is being asked in like 3 or 4 collaborations that you have, and you really don't have a good answer, that's a good sign that, well, let's make a step back. Let's see if we can mathematically formulate this problem and kind of then answer it in a more rigorous way, not just like in an ad hoc way for that particular project. And then this is nice because it motivates development of new methodology. So that certainly, I would say I learned a lot. I also learned a lot about the domain of, in particular, about certain aspects of drug development and molecular interaction mapping. And that really has informed my view of research in particular area, because it's important to know when we apply our models to certain applications, what are those high stakes or most impactful applications, right? So certain type of data now can be generated in a high throughput manner. And so it's potentially less impactful if you can kind of make certain advances or applications in that front, because it can already in a way be solved by just the advances that we have seen in biotechnology. So really then, by interacting with those scientists, I learned a lot about what are the core problems and questions that the biomedical field cares about, that they think are hard challenges. And then my goal is primarily, let's work on those challenges where we can help most of them and contribute most to those scientists. I would say in the last few years, I also generally observed there's a lot of increasing interest in machine learning, in AI, that comes from that community. So I would say like 5 years ago, when I was like still a PhD student or starting my postdoc, it was often the case that or like 5 to 7 years ago, I had to knock on the doors of biologists and many of clinical researchers. I knocked on their offices and say, I have this model, do you have any data? I would like to apply my model to your data, I'd like to collaborate with you. And kind of nowadays, it's almost the reverse. Generally, these communities have become sufficiently aware of some of the key advances in this AI field, which is really important, because in order to be able to collaborate, we need to be able to speak common language. Of course, they don't need to know about all the ways we do contrastive estimation or the ways we specify neighborhood sampling in graph neural networks and so on. But it's really important for them to understand what is the input, what is the output, how are the data treated in the way, how are batch effects removed, how to interpret predictions. These are really important basic questions that users need to understand. And substantial progress has been made on that front. And generally, I see that now there's lots of interest coming from biomedical world into AI, machine learning, data science more generally, which is, I think, great for our community, or like for machine learning people. And there are lots of opportunities to collaborate and work in these areas.
Yeah, sure. So from a high level, what are some of the biggest challenges that you face when you're applying machine learning to these areas? Like, are you spending most of your day wrangling the data, finding the data, or are you finding more conceptual challenges? Yeah.
I would say both. Especially with new problems, it's often the case that there aren't readily available benchmark data sets or data sets in general that one could just simply use. So in practice, that means that in order to get a data set that you will use for developing the method, or getting a data set that you will use to apply a method that you have previously developed, it's not as easy as you go to a website and you just download a TSV file that has a very nice, or a zip file that has 3 files: training, validation, and test set, or like even just access and download the data by a single line of code in PyTorch or Python Geometric or TensorFlow or other library. So it really means that often we need to build our data set. So we spend quite a bit of efforts and quite a bit of time and put effort into building high quality biomedical data sets, and then also releasing them and sharing them with the community, especially with other computer scientists who are also increasingly interested in kind of testing and applying models that were potentially in the last 2 decades very often motivated by other types of networks like social or information networks. And now there's lots of interest also in other in networks that are biological, or networks that come from chemistry or physics, and kind of this requires data sets to be created. So in my group and with collaborators, we have put together a number of benchmark data sets. One of them is called BioSnap, which is a collection of biomedical data sets. Recently we released together with collaborators OGB, which is the Open Graph Benchmark. And it has a number of graph data sets from different areas, different domains, including biology and medicine, and are intended for benchmarking and developing graph machine learning. So I spent quite a bit of time preparing the data, but then most of the effort is actually in very principled computational models and developing of the methods. And in doing so, we made some kind of quite surprising observations where we noticed that, for example, that certain fundamental observations that are principles that underlie lots of machine learning in graphs are really valid in other types of networks, say social information, friendship networks, but really they do not apply to biological networks such as protein interaction networks. Like one such fundamental principle is known as homophily. So the idea is, well, if you are 3 people, ABC, a friend of my friend will likely also to be my friend, or at least eventually become my friend. And this creates these triangles of people that are all friends with each other. And it kind of makes sense, and it has been studied extensively in at all in some types of networks.
Going forward and looking at the future of the intersection of machine learning and biomedicine, where do you see the field going, and where are you most excited to see it go in the next 5-10 years?
I think there's lots of opportunities for the area of research at the intersection of machine learning and biology and medicine. So certainly I see that what will happen is hopefully more close integration of machine learning and biomedical data. I really hope that we will be able to realize this excitement and potential of machine learning for biology and medicine by seeing many successful deployments of the methods in real world.
And that real world might mean in clinics or hospitals, or being those machine learning models used next kind of as assistants to clinical researchers or biologists in the wet lab. So kind of lots of, I think, progress can be made towards this aspirational goal of automated science. And I'm particularly excited about the opportunities that are possible here in the drug development, which is really expensive, tremendously expensive, and time resource and resource intensive project. And at each stage of that process, stage of drug development process, there are a number of problems that need to be solved with where AI and machine learning components could help in either assist domain experts or could help expedite, accelerate some of the processes there. And drug development is just like one example of a very important process that we kind of see in biomedical research and pharmaceutical research and related fields. So I really hope that this enthusiasm will translate well to many successful applications that down the line will really have a positive effect on patients. At the same time, we also need to be very thoughtful about how we apply and use those models, and really think about how we can rigorously test them and make sure that they work before we apply and deploy them. So yeah, that's what I hope for. And of course, on the methodological side of things, the parts that I'm kind of very excited about are certainly related to being able to design kind of more or like language that allow us to answer and kind of pose and ask and answer questions that are really questions that the users would care about and can provide as precise predictions as possible. By that, I mean, like if I give a concrete example, if a model simply makes prediction that drug A will treat disease B, and this is everything the model can say, that is really not so exciting, or like it's great and it's exciting, but it's not actionable. It does not give immediately a plan or an idea to user how to act upon that prediction. So how can we make predictions more actionable in the sense that the model would be able to predict that the drug will treat the disease, and the way this will happen is by drug affecting these particular molecules in the body, and then those molecules will change their behavior and they would affect certain other tissues or systems, and then down the line they would have a positive therapeutic effect. So this kind of this aspiration is something that drives me a lot and drives lots of my research. In order to be able to do that, then we need to think about scalable models that can answer and kind of model and kind of reason about data more generally, rather than simply make kind of link predictions or node labels. And I think that's something where that many people are currently working on and thinking about. So I hope that we'll see lots of progress in the coming years.
Yeah, for sure. I've been doing some reading recently about self-explaining neural nets, and they are super interesting. So I would love to see how that plays out, and hopefully it's involved in drug development and usage. So to shift gears a little bit, I'd love to learn more about you and your trajectory. So how did you get into the field, and how did your background lead you into the career trajectory that you've chosen?
Okay, so that's a great question. So by training, I'm a computer scientist. I did my bachelor's in computer science and mathematics back in Europe. I did my Ph.D. in computer science very quickly, or like in a short period of time after my bachelor's, and that was also in Europe. And during my PhD, I started thinking about biology or like in medicine quite a bit. In particular, some of the algorithms that we developed, that I developed as part of the study, have attracted attention from groups in biology and medicine from around the world, and they have invited me to spend some time actually being embedded in molecular biology departments at University of Toronto, and then Baylor College of Medicine in Houston and Imperial College in London. And those were all concrete examples where I was able to put the algorithms that I developed in use together with some of the domain experts. And that has really inspired me to see how I can contribute as a computer scientist to a field that is really not my area of expertise, and that can be done through very thoughtful collaboration. So after I wrapped up my PhD in around 3 years, then I decided it'd be a great time for me to move to the States, and I moved to Stanford, where I spent 3 fantastic years in computer science department, working with Yuri Leskovets, and also working with Chan Zuckerberg Biohub and foundation on the West Coast. And then late last year, in 2019, I moved to East Coast, and now I'm here in Boston. Well, I'm super happy. I started building my group and mentoring students at Harvard, where my lab is primarily affiliated with Department of Biomedical Informatics, but then also I work and I'm affiliated with the Blavatnik Institute, and also very happy to work with a number of kind of groups at MIT through AI Cures initiatives and other initiatives. So it's really a wonderful place, I think, here in Boston, especially for those who are interested in biotech or healthcare and kind of interface or technology and interface with healthcare and biology and medicine, because there's so many opportunities. I almost feel like I'm in a candy shop and there's so many candies to kind of pick and then decide what you want to work on. So I'm super happy to be here.
Yeah, Cambridge is a really special place. That's why I chose MIT too. So for students that are interested in learning more about machine learning, do you have recommendations for how they should start? For example, should they start more on the theoretical side, or should they start with an applied project and kind of fill in the gaps as they go?
That's a great question, and I often get such questions. So I would say that, especially for students who are interested in scientific academic research, no matter while if they think they will work more on theory or on applied side of projects, I would certainly encourage to take some fundamental courses in machine learning, both from the theoretical side as well as from the applied side, because this will really, really be useful down the line. So even if you're interested in applied machine learning, it's really important to be able to understand fundamental questions and problems related to generalizations, related to more classic and now kind of modern neural type of machine learning, how to design objective functions, what are the questions we need to pay attention to, what are the questions related to optimizing those models, what are the traps that we need to kind of take into account. And then also students who are more interested in the theoretical side of things, I think it's really good for those students to be exposed to some of the applied problems, because that way they can kind of see what are the challenges that occur in real world. For example, if applications are done in certain very limited settings where there is not enough many resources, that would require them to think about how to learn with very small data sets, which can be a very nice also theoretical problem. And it's also good to see what are the constraints or the situations in real world when that happens. So I would say, as to start, I would certainly encourage students to take initial fundamental broad machine learning courses in applied area as well as on more theoretical side, or like at least the side where one needs to understand the model and be able to somehow write it down, understand what it does, understand really objective function, not simply import a particular function from a Python package, but really be able to understand what it does. And then down the line, of course, it makes sense, given that the field is growing so rapidly, to specialize in particular area of research, and they then take more specialized courses that might be either geared towards graph or towards certain areas of research, either robotics or reinforcement learning or language processing. But really, it's important for everyone to get those foundations right.
I think that's great advice. So last question to wrap up then is, do you have any more advice for younger students, especially women, that might be interested in the field, especially the intersection of machine learning and biomedicine?
Great. So first, I would really encourage all kind of women that are, or like girls that are interested in these areas, to kind of jump in and try to find good allies and try to find projects to work on. And in particular, try to find great advisors and mentors. I think those best advisors and mentors are those that are essentially cheerleaders for their students. So you should find those people. There are many of mentors that can be found in colleges, at universities, or like non-profit organizations or meetups, and kind of that that I think might, even if they are not so senior, just a few years older than you, or like or high school students, if we are talking about them, then I think it's really useful to be able to interact with them, to be able to get guidance and mentorship from slightly senior or more senior mentors. So certainly my advice would be, don't be afraid, be confident about your skills and speak up and kind of work on projects that are really of interest to you. Certainly reach out, especially at university level. There is like, it's really, I would encourage students to reach out to professors who they think would be good mentors. And in order to be able to learn about who are potential mentors, what are problems that one might work on, or just be able to learn about machine learning, especially if somebody is not necessarily has much experience, I really highly encourage attending various events. So especially at universities, like here in Boston areas, there are many seminar series that are focused on machine learning or the interface between machine learning and other domains. I would certainly encourage attending those events, attending various meetups or conferences. Especially nowadays, lots of conferences are online this year. Because of that, some of the conferences are free for students, and there's no registration. So I would certainly encourage people to attend talks, learn about what is the exciting area of research, and talk to people, find and kind of learn about projects and learn about potential mentors that then you can start working with. So I think that's really important, to find good role models and mentors that can help guide you through these very quickly growing and rapidly changing area of research.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this. I learned a lot about the field and your perspective. So thank you so much again for taking the time to meet with us.
Of course. Thank you so much, Jackie. That's been really a wonderful experience. And thank you so much for inviting me. It was great to be here today.